Have you ever stopped and asked yourself, how do you actually know what you know about history? No, I don't mean the whole you learn it in school thing. Iman, who told you? Who decided what was worth remembering and what should be forgotten? And who gets to be the hero in those stories? There's an old Ziyang cliché as it sounds, but distinctly true, history is written by victors. And the scary part is, well, that's not just a claviquet, that's reality, a raw, uncomfortable truth we've heard so many times we've stopped questioning it. Think, Abuti, after every war, every revolution, every period off chows, the ones left standing get to tell Festeri and Funyanao. They always paint themselves as the good guys and their enemies, the monsters, even if they were the ones who did the most brutal things. And then we go on to study that version of history in school, read it in textbooks, watch it in documentaries. Slowly, we start to believe it's objective, but hold on, objective. Since when do American showboats talk about native people as brave defenders of their homeland? Have you ever seen a German textbook that says World War II left a wound on the soul of humanity that still has kneeled? Or do they just keep learning how to apologize over and over again? The bigger question is who gets to decide what's worth telling. Look at Misesas, the so-called temples of human memory. Who gets to choose who's in happenings and who just vanishes? It's no accident we all know names like Caesar, Napoleon, and Washington. But barely anyone has heard of Zulu warriors, male leaders, or the forgotten women generals of Africa. Why is that? Because history is never neutral. It's a weapon, powerful enough to make an entire people feel ashamed of their ancestors, or proud of things they never act. And that weapon, since ancient times, has always been in the hands of those who understand one thing clearly. Whoever controls the past controls the present, and whoever controls the present shapes the future. From the earliest laws in Babylon to the stone carvings of ancient Egypt, from the Enuma Elish to the Hebrew Bible, every civilization has tried to reshape truth to serve power. You think it was just a coincidence that pharaohs called themselves the living embodiment of truth? Of course not. It was a genius move, blending politics with mythology so that anyone who questioned the government was also seen as an enemy of the. And then came the empires. Rome mastered the art of erasing Mori. Slave rebellions buried in vague footnotes, conquered cultures dismissed as uncivilizative. And when the Christian church rose to power, memory control entered a whole new era. It wasn't just retelling the past anymore. It was rewriting. The Gnostic Gospels rebranded pagan festivals into Christian holidays, and of course, torched the library of Alexandria, the largest repository of ancient knowledge. Accident or a deliberate reset of humanity's memory? Bit by bit, century by century, history has been edited, twisted, and chopped up, and every time, Thathapand, power changed hands. But truth never came back on its own. This isn't just about ancient times. It's a current flowing from the distant past to right now, a continuous stream of manipulation, and we're all living in a version of history that someone else picked for us. But who is that someone else who touched history and left no fingerprints? That answer isn't simple, but if you're ready to keep going, I'll walk you through the faded trails they left behind, from Babylon to the Vatican, from Pope's Tospies, and from Gutenberg's printing press to Utobasa, because history isn't dead. It's just being told by those who know how to take control. But maybe the scariest thing isn't what gets told. It's what never gets told at Albaca's history. When you really think about it, isn't just the story of those who won. It's also a long, growing list of names we've forgotten endlessly. That list just keeps getting longer. Ever notice where most of what we know about the past comes from? 3 places: textbooks, museums, and monuments. These so-called guardians of memory aren't just places to store history. They're places that choose history. Who writes the textbooks? Who decides what gets taught in 6th grade, 9th grade, and 12th grade? Who sits on those editorial boards? And who gets shut out for being too controversial? And museums. Look at how their engraved marble statues, war dioramas, and national flags are all laid out with a These are the things worth remembering. Boutwell says so. Have you ever seen a major Western museum show colonial crimes in a truly honest way? Do any exhibits show how Belgian soldiers cut off the hands of Congolese people? Is there a hall that tells of the millions who starved under British rule in India? And back to the textbooks. What do American students learn about the Vietnam War? That it was a fight against communism? Or do they hear about palm-scorched villages and generations of Vietnamese children who never got to know peace? But it's not just America. Students in other countries aren't necessarily getting the full story either. In Japan, official history books once described the invasion of China as a regional stabilization effort, and in China, textbooks almost completely avoid mentioning the failure of the Cultural Revolution. What do all of these have in common? They don't flat-outly, but they carefully pick which truths to tell. And that selective storytelling is the most subtle form of manipulation. You don't have to burn a library to erase them. Just never mention them, and they disappear. Ever heard Hypatia, the last great philosopher of Alexandria? She was skinned alive and murdered by a mob while the church turned a blind eye. She once stood as a symbol of knowledge, science, and independent thinking, but her name was wiped from the official record for nearly 1,000 years. It wasn't until the 20th century that the world even started to remember her. Or what about the African women warriors who led resistance movements against French and Portuguese settlers? Have you ever seen their names in a history book? Even in Vietnam's own history, have you heard of Levantum, the hero martyr said to have burnt himself alive in an act of resistance? Later on, researchers couldn't find any concrete evidence he ever existed. But the question isn't whether he was real. The question is, why would anyone need to invent a figure like that? Because history isn't just about the past. It's about how we design collective memory. It's the spiritual map of a nation. And when that map is drawn wrong, entire generations grow up lost. So don't ever think of history as something already written. It's not over. It's being rewritten every single day in textbooks, in museum tours, in school lessons, and in the statues we build and the ones we tear down. And most importantly, it's being rewritten by those who get to choose what's remembered. And in this world, the power to choose what gets remembered is an invisible kind offerer, but perhaps the most absolute kind there is. But there's something even deeper than choosing what gets told. It's about who gets to tell it. Think about it. Before writing existed, how was history passed down? Through stories, through memory, and through word abuma. And that means only the ones who survived got to keep telling the story. Those who didn't lost their voice entirely. Ever thought about that a culture could have thousands of years of story, but all it takes is one invasion, one plague, or a few decades of forced assimilation, and it's gone. Not because it never existed, but because no one's left to tell it. That's why the invention of writing wasn't just a leap in human progress. It was also the first real tool for controlling Mori, who were the first people to learn how to write. The priesthood, educatidalites, and people close top power. They were the ones trusted with writing down what was allowed to be remembered. Those clay tablets from Sumer, the papyrus scrolls of Egypt, and the stone carvings of the Hittite Empire weren't forever known. And more importantly, no one else was allowed to rewrite them. Ancient writing wasn't made for theomesses. It was and that privilege stayed in the hands of a very small group, usually royalty, priests, or the ruling class. And then centuries later, when printing came along, instead of setting in free, it opened the door to a whole new kind of control. Gutenberg is often hailed as the father of the but did you know that right after the printing press was invented, both the church and the state moved quickly to seize control of it in Europe at the time? If you wanted to publish a book, you needed a license. Every printed page had to be proved. Anything considered heretical, rebellious, or a threat to public order was banned, and the author Sumitamiso. And that kind of control wasn't just in Europe and China. Woodblock. Printing was invented early on, but to wit, who was allowed to use it? Themper, the court, the scholar elite, not the Cayman people, not those with stories that clashed with official history. Across the world, tools for writing and recording weren't invented to empower everyone. They were created to protect the power of a few. Language followed the same pattern. In India, Sanskrit was once a sacred language, but only Brahmins were allowed to study. In Europe for centuries, the Bible was only written in Latin, meaning ordinary people couldn't read it themselves. They had to rely on official interpretations. So even if you had a story to tell, you didn't have the language to tell it in a way that could be heard. Now imagine hundreds of civilizations, from Africa, from rock Columbian America, and from ancient Australia, each with their own history, myths, and memories, but without writing systems, without printing presses, and without official documents to protect those. One a conquest, one wave of assimilation, and it all gets wiped clean. Writing and printing language are not neutral tools, they're filters, and the real power doesn't lie in who tells the story. It lies in who controls the filter. Today, we read books, search Wikipedia, listen to podcasts, and ask Google, and it feels like we have total freedom of information. But in truth, we're still consuming what's digitized, curated, and tagged as reliable. And the scary part, sometimes an entire culture doesn't need to bend away. All it takes is for no one to reprint it, or no one to translate it into a major language, and just like that, it vanishes. And if we trace history all the way back to the world's earliest civilizations, back when writing and law were just buying burn, we'll notice something very clear. History was never meant to be a neutral record of thepist. From the very beginning, it was a tool, a weapon used to hold on top power. Let's start with Babylon. When people talk about Mesopotamia, they usually mention the great cities, the rivers, and of course the Code of Hammurabi, one of Fuman, history's first written legal codes. However, most people overlook the fact that this was a historical declaration rather than mere legislation. Look at the first line of that code. The first lines, in which Hammurabi declares, I, Hammurabi, chosen by the gods, bring justice to the world, are more important than the laws and penalties. It seems familiar. This is the traditional formula, using supernatural authority to legitimize political power, that legislation was set in stone. It was not so commonplace that people could read it without exclaiming, "Who has the right to question, alter, or oppose a law that was created by the gods and passed down through the king?" As you can see, this was not only a legal document, it was also among the first instances of official history in which a single individual establishes what is correct, documents it, and becomes the protagonist. One thing becomes evident, right away. History in ancient civilizations was inextricably linked to politics. This is particularly evident when considering ancient Egypt. The highest representation of that order was Mart, the goddess of justice, harmony, and truth. The pharaohs were not merely monarchs. They were regarded as living gods who represented truth. The problem is that Mart wasn't truthful in the sense that we currently understand it, such as scientific objectivity. The pharaoh himself established Mart as a religious order and philosophy. He dominated not just with warriors, but also with mythological-style myths and a narrative of history. Temple walls were engraved with military triumphs. The universe was depicted as testing Pharaoh's might, and every struggle ended in victory when nature struck out. See what's happening here. When the ruler has complete control over the story, every failure can be conveniently removed from the record or reframed as fate or a heavenly testing. Additionally, don't assume that this was merely an old phenomenon. Everywhere, this idea of legitimizing history through supernatural authority was imitated. The origin of it all began in Babylon and Egypt, where writing, law, and religion were combined into a single, potent storytelling machine. For the first time, history wasn't the voice of a community, but rather the voice of a king carved into stone that would last forever. This is evident in everything from ancient China's mandate of heaven to medieval Europe's divine right of kings to contemporary regimes that declare their leaders the light of the nation. When a story is sufficiently long, people cease to doubt it and begin to accept it as true. Yet there is something much more nuanced than laws or holy titles. It's when authority creates a whole worldview to persuade people that the cosmos would collapse in the absence of power, rather than merely using history to support its claims. This is precisely what the Babylonians accomplished with the Enuma Elish, their ancient creation myth engraved on 7 clay tablets. It appears to be just another mythological story at first, but upon closer inspection, it turns out to be the unwritten constitution of the first centralized state in history. The narrative opens in a state of turmoil. Ancient gods, warring and conflict, erupting in a swirling mixture of fresh and salt water. The gods of the next generation rebel against the old. As the violence increases, one deity emerges, Marduk. The intriguing thing is that, despite not being the first creator, the strongest god, or the oldest, Marduk made an offer. Marduk kills Tiamat, the goddess of chows, because if I win this conflict, I will bring order back, but in exchange, I will become the ultimate god forever. He divides her body in two to create the earth and the sky, and then he makes humanity to serve the gods using a rebellious god's blood. Perhaps it sounds like a wild myth, but try changing a few terms today. Marduk takes over as King Tiamat is the previous government. The emblem of chaos. Political reform is the key to victory. Humans were made as instruments to support the new order, which is a centralized governing structure. Enuma Elish is more than just a myth. It is a declaration of victory by a ruling dynasty. Delivered in cosmic language, it is also one of the oldest known examples of state propaganda because it was read aloud at the Babylonian New Year festival. Each year, in front of the populace and officials, the identical story was told to the public each year. They were reminded annually that the status quo is not only rational but also holy. They were told every year that without Marduk, the world would revert to Tiamat's dark, terrible, and uncontrollable chaos. Take a look at what's going on here. In this instance, history serves as a tool to safeguard the present and influence the future, rather than being about the past. And from this point on, a strong notion emerged. History has a purpose. It is no longer merely a community's collective memory. Oral tradition is no longer practiced. It's a well-written tale with a message, a conclusion, and a single, obvious objective: to validate the current ruling class. Numerous epic traditions have been based on the same model since Enuma Elish. The Mahabharata describes a great battle between two royal lineages in India. However, upholding Dharma, the sacred order, is always the main focus. Simeon's historical writings in China were more than just chronicles. They were teachings intended to caution and direct emperors in the future. Even though a lot of it conflicted with archaeological discoveries, the Hebrew Bible in Europe rewrote ancient folktales into a national history that offered divine justification for a newly formed people. This is all based on a single, subdued, yet potent concept. If the first myth used to legitimize power was Enuma Elish, then the Hebrew Bible is arguably the most famous example of rewriting history. This is because the story we tell about the past determines who gets to rule in the present. For this reason, those in power were concerned from the beginning not only with who held the sword, but also with who held the pen. Not only to document history, but to build a people. At this moment, history ceased to be who we are and instead became who we were selected to be. It did more than merely record occurrences. It gave people a reason to migrate, fight for a place, and think that it was a divine right that God had given them. You've undoubtedly heard the well-known tale. Moses leads the Jewish people out of Egypt after they are enslaved there. After 40 years of wandering the desert, they finally arrive in the promised land of Canaan, where the patriarch Abraham is promised a country that flows with milk and honey. It sounds amazing. Here's the issue though. Israeli professor Israel Finkelstein and other contemporary archaeologists have not discovered any convincing proof of the Exodus. No indication of a large-scale migration. There is no archaeological evidence of the type of biblical conquest of Canaan, and the so-called ancient Israelites seem to have been native people rather than refugees from the Sinai desert. What does that signify? It indicates that the Hebrew Bible is not an objective, factual account of what happened. It is an assertion of national identity and a compelling story written by a group of individuals. They created a magnificent origin tale in which a chosen race was persecuted before being saved by supernatural intervention, and that's not out of the ordinary. Every country eventually rewrites its history to define itself, But the Bible goes one step farther. What doesn't fit is erased. The ancient myths of QAnon were destroyed. The local deities called them fake idols. Adjacent tribes are shown as evil, sinful, and deserving of annihilation. Whole cities like Jericho and Ai are destroyed in the book of Joshua as a result of conflict, but rather as a result of divine purification, not conquering, but the realization of God's holy promise. Look at what's occurring here. History is no longer what we did. God picked us, so we were permitted to do it. Any action, from eradicating entire civilizations to rewriting the entire history of the world, can be justified, provided it is done in God's name. It's no accident that the three main Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, were founded on the Hebrew Bible. And it's no accident that the dispute over who is the true author of the Bible has led to some of the worst wars in human history. Naturally, this does not negate the spiritual, moral, or cultural significance of religion. Yet, it is important to acknowledge this. The history found in the Bible is not objective. It is an intentional history that serves as a guide for national identity, divine mission, and power over disputed territories. Empires all across the world would subsequently adopt that strategy of rewriting history to increase their dominance, and new technology would allow them to go even farther. Compiled, edited, filtered, and then published as official history. The source of it all is found in these hallowed pages, where rewriting memory was also a means of establishing authority. If purpose-driven history began with the Hebrew Bible, then ancient Rome was when the official history machine was at its most effective, and it all started with something that makes perfect sense. Historians of the state. One thing was widely understood throughout the Roman Empire: a common language for the past detail that everyone could accept, recite, and learn was necessary to govern a huge region inhabited by hundreds of different ethnic groups, languages, and religions. For this reason, they established the position of historian as the state's official historian. They wrote about the emperor's triumphs, but their role was to preserve the empire's memory, not to find the truth. They portrayed every uprising as treason, as pointless pandemonium that needed to be put down, and as victories that never occurred, at least not officially. Consider how official Roman history seldom mentions Spartacus, the slave leader who appended the Roman system, other than a few brief lines filled with scorn, and then nothing. Caesar's campaigns and Augustus's triumphs, meanwhile, read like epic poetry in tiresome books dedicated to their exaltation. Roman history evolved into a form of theater. Every reign was a prewritten play, with the emperors as the main characters, and the populace, whether living or dead, as supporting characters. Those who didn't fit the plot were occasionally literally wiped. Are you familiar with damnatio memoriale? It was Rome's ultimate penalty, which was to destroy a person's memory rather than kill them. Everyone was prohibited from speaking their name again, and their name would be carved off stone, their monuments removed, and literature referencing them burnt. Put another way, you might as well not have existed if Rome didn't like you, and you would only be a shadow if someone discovered a trace of you centuries later. A question mark in history with no remaining evidence to bring you back. This was intentional, structured, and methodical memory engineering, not merely a rewriting of history. And the most bizarre aspect of it is that Romans didn't conceal it. They simply cared that history served stability. They never asserted that it was about the truth. Obedience was more important than truth, which didn't have to be true. It was sufficient to maintain order. It was not necessary to be objective. It was sufficient to convince people that Rome never dies. Roman inscriptions always sounded so magnificent and final because of this. Augustus, Thegid's son, delivered peace to the globe through his conquest. But who exactly did he bring peace to Roman citizens? Perhaps. What about the vanished tribes and conquered peoples? Their stories were never repeated, and what they received was quiet rather than peace. Fear and memory control produce a calm. You see, in ancient Rome, history was no longer told. Rather, it was a political tool that could be used to your advantage. You only needed people to forget. You didn't need more troops or to destroy it. And as the Roman Empire started to fall apart, the power to control history, memory, symbols, and even silence didn't go away. Instead, it was transferred to something more elusive, sacred, and far more enduring: the Christian Church. And that model, that memory control machinery, would soon be inherited by a new force that was more religious, powerful, and even more skilled in shaping the future, in addition to controlling the past. Consider it. People in Europe didn't destroy Rome's memory machine. But when most empires fall, their interpretation of history usually does too. Instead of the emperor being the son of a god, they sanctified it, and the pope became the embodiment of God on earth. God's commandments were written in scripture, preached from pulpits, and most importantly, ever translated into the language of the general populace. Did you ever notice that the Bible was written only in Latin for almost a millennium? A language that only aristocrats and clergy could understand. This meant that common people could only hear the Bible repeated and reinterpreted in the manner permitted by the church, and they could never read it in their native tongue. And throughout that time period, notably, was the narrative of God kept secret, but also all of human history. Have you heard of the Gnostic Gospels? They were ancient writings that offered a drastically different interpretation of Jesus' teachings, probably even older than portions of the canonical New Testament. Less emphasis on punishment. However, the Church deemed them heretics. They were extinguished, prohibited from being reproduced, and removed from official records. What about the ancient pagan festivals honoring the sun, the fertility goddesses, the harvest gods, and others? They weren't eliminated. Instead, they were given new names. The sun god's birthday is now Christmas. The earth goddess's spring festival, it's Easter now. In the same way, earlier civilizations were renamed, sanitized, and approved rather than eradicated. However, the most significant loss of all hundreds of thousands of Greek scrolls were housed at the Library of Alexandria, a vast repository of knowledge. Egypt, India, and Persia, nobody can agree on who destroyed it, when, or why. But one thing is certain: the Church never really tried to preserve information outside of Christian theology over the years. If it wasn't destroyed, any material that didn't follow church doctrine was prohibited from being reproduced, distributed, or translated. That means that a book that isn't read might as well have never been written. The Church used more than faith to govern the present. It governed the past by determining what constituted truth and who was permitted to read it. That model endured for centuries and made a lasting impression. Intentional illiteracy was prevalent throughout Europe. not because people couldn't read, but rather because they were denied access to knowledge outside of what the church deemed appropriate. Therefore, one thing becomes evident when you look back in time, from Babylon to Egypt to Enuma Elish, to the Bible to Rome, to the church. From the beginning of time until the Middle Ages, history was never a natural flow. Rather, it was a meticulously curated sequence that was rewritten, reinterpreted, sanitized, legalized, and eventually canonized. And it didn't end there, because the same question persisted even after the printing industry gave rise to the so-called revolution of knowledge. If there is one symbol that embodies everything that history has attempted to forget, it is the Library of Alexandria. Who gets to print, who gets approval, who gets banned, and who determines what constitutes truth? It is frequently described as a tragedy. Burnt were hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Humanity lost an invaluable part of its past when ancient knowledge was wiped. But few people stopped to consider who actually set it on fire, and, more crucially, why there are so many tales. Bishop Theophilus and a Christian mob are blamed by some, while Julius Caesar is blamed by others. Later Islamic conquests are mentioned in several hypotheses. However, if we ignore the names, one fact stays the same. Knowledge preservation was not a top priority for whoever was in charge at the time, because the Alexandrian Library was more than just a library. It was a multidimensional historical map that depicted Egyptian mythology, the Babylonian astronomy and Greek philosophy, Persian mathematics, and Indian medicine coexisted in dozens of languages. It was hazardous because it contained alternative worldviews that were unfiltered by doctrine, unapproved by royal order, uncontrolled, untamed, and unaligned. Consider it. What is the biggest danger if a political or religious empire wishes to impose its official narrative of history, a location filled of uncontrollable memory, rather than an army narratives that deviate from scriptural facts and have no place in scripture or found in the Alexandrian Library? Therefore, whoever set it on was not acting by chance. Rather, it was a blatant act that followed a pattern that had been repeated for thousands of years. It's safer to delete knowledge if you can't control it, and the effects are impossible to quantify. More than 90% of all ancient literature, according to some, has been permanently lost. We no longer possess the original writings of innumerably Socratic philosophers, and, even more concerning, we have no idea how Babylonian astronomers charted the stars. That's the really scary thing. Not the actual fire, but the way memory fades away in silence, and how history is altered as a result, and how someone chooses what should be remembered and what should be church. And now two contemporary information systems. Don't you see it now? The destruction of the Alexandrian Library and mysterious hands have always impacted history. It was the peak of a silent, continuing current rather than its start or finish. Human knowledge was no longer destroyed by swords or fires once the libraries were burnt and the old scrolls were removed. The more knowledge lost, the simpler it is to construct a new truth. We refer to that period as the Middle Ages, but for knowledge, it was the age of linguistic imprisonment, particularly with regard to the Bible, the most revered and significant text in the Western world, and, for centuries, the most strictly regulated text. Have you ever wondered why the Bible was written and read exclusively in Latin for a millennium? It wasn't because God spoke Latin exclusively. nor was it because Latin was considered a more sacred language than other languages. And the solution is straightforward. The medieval church established an intellectual monopoly, unlike any other in history, because Latin was a language that the average person couldn't understand, and because if you can't read a book, you have no choice except to trust whoever reads it for you. Control over access to knowledge, as well as control over knowledge itself, making books illegible, rather than outright banning them instead of burning manuscripts. They wrote them in a language that only they could understand, and that gave them the authority to do so. Not all priests were guys with formal education. They were the truth's translators, and if you dared to disagree with their interpretation, you were without evidence, because they were the guardians of your beliefs, and you were unable to read the original. Anyone who attempted to translate the Bible into a local language, German, English, or French, was labeled a heretic. The first person to translate the complete Bible into English from Hebrew and ancient Greek, bold yet exquisitely straightforward. Belief, even the field plowboy ought to read the Bible. Because of this conviction, he was detained, strangled, and executed by burning at the stake. Given that it is a religion that promotes truth and love, doesn't it seem contradictory? Killing a guy for the sole purpose of educating others about the truth is not contradictory. But if you view history through the prism of power, it is. Because language served as a social barrier in the medieval era, in addition to being a means of communication, the few who could read and speak the correct language now owned the history that should have belonged to everyone. And if you learned Latin, you were above everyone else. The Bible is not the only source of science and medicine. Philosophies, they were hand-copied in Latin in monasteries, and only clergy members were allowed to handle them. Of humanity could not be controlled by anybody other than the priesthood. Suddenly, the world was governed by ideas rather than by weapons. People's inability to articulate their oppression was the reason they didn't rebel, not their ignorance. When language was restricted, the Bible was monopolized, and books were solely in the hands of fraists. Anybody who ventured to recount the tale in a different way was viewed as dangerous, because you can't resist what you feel once you don't have the words to express it. Not killers, not criminals, only historians, scientists, philosophers. That it only took one sentence. One concept that defied theology was the notion that the globe revolved around the sun, or worse, that people could comprehend history independently without the consent of religious authorities. That was sufficient to declare you a heretic, sufficient to have you sought, tried, and killed by fire, not bisword. Why fire was said to cleanse the spirit, yet it actually obliterate demires. A person's books and knowledge were destroyed when they were burnt, died alongside them. Giordano was one of the most eerie cases. Bruno, in addition to being a philosopher, Bruno was among the first free thinkers in contemporary Europe. He questioned the notion of a closed cosmos, where everything circled around Earth, where mankind was at the center of everything, and where there was only one version of reality, since he thought the universe was infinite and could have numerous worlds, suns, and forms of life. Bruno wasn't a scientist in the contemporary sense. Rather, he was a dreamer, a storyteller, and someone who raised issues that the establishment didn't want addressed. As a result, the church had him arrested in 1600. Bruno was burnt alive in Rome's Campo de' Fiori after being told to repent. The irony is that Bruno's anti-science beliefs did not lead to his death, because he touched the one taboo that no authority could bear. He was too far ahead of his time and perished. History isn't set in stone, that anyone has the freedom to tell the story whatever they see fit. You see it now, don't you? Power doesn't have to disprove you when it feels threatened. It simply needs to silence you, because no one reproduced them. So many versions of history vanished not because they were worthless, but because they were not authorized to exist. Nobody taught them or read to them. Today, we refer to that as a deficiency of historical sources. However, in reality, someone made sure they were removed. You're starting to realize that your history hasn't been skewed by loud lies. Silently, it burns one person while instilling fear in the others, by giving the impression that there is only one correct way to recall the past, and that if you remember it differently, something is wrong with you. Power over minds is more than just power over speech, and Bruno wasn't the end of it. Other truth-tellers, such as the Cathars, Templars, and Rosicrucians, were also exterminated not because they lacked morals, but rather because their beliefs conflicted with the official narrative being written. The Crusades demonstrate the reverse. If Bruno's death demonstrated that providing an incorrect account of official history may result in your erasure, you can kill without ever having to apologize if you write the authorized version of history, because you will no longer be killing. The Holy Land is being freed by you. You're damn defending the faith, not invading, and you're not killing people. It is sufficient that you are carrying out a divine assignment from God. No explanation is required. No truth is necessary. Western history texts frequently portray the Crusades, particularly the first one in 1096, as a valiant armed journey intended to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim infidels. Tens of thousands of aristocrats, peasants, and even criminals who were forgiven if they joined marched east after taking up the cross and drawing their swords in response to that summons. However, many Western historians spent generations ignoring the flood of atrocities that accompanied the phrase liberation. When the Crusaders arrived in Jerusalem in 1099, Raymond of Agalaz, a contemporary chronicler, wrote about the event. Muslims were massacred within their mosques. Jews were burnt alive inside their synagogues, and blood reached our horses' ankles in Solomon's temple. No trials, no mercy, no differentiation between soldiers and civilians. However, this was depicted in the official documents that followed as a triumph of faith, a just response to centuries of oppression, and a holy effort to restore truth. It sounds familiar, so begin the walk and write the story afterward. The finished version of the story will smell of divine destiny rather than blood when the person with the sword also wields the pen. Take a look at the subsequent recording of history. Campaigns to promote the gospel were the name given to the Northern Crusades, the eradication of the pagan populations in the Baltics that were advancing the frontier civilization. Those who deviated from the official position, such as the Catholic, a Christian movement in southern France, were labeled heretics, and the sack of Constantinople in 1204 was dismissed as a sad event. The outcome of the first-time Christians waged a crusade against other Christians in the name of God was the Albigensian Crusade, a remark frequently ascribed to the then-current Crusader leader. God will know his own if you kill them all. Again, isn't it chilling? The truth was not shielded by history. it safeguarded power. It didn't question who was correct. It was about who had the right to write. And that makes us wonder, how many battles have been called liberation, and how many murderers have been made into heroes only for fighting for the right cause. The Crusades expose a harsh reality. In the shadowy nooks and crannies of the Middle Ages, when everything was strictly regulated, every word had to be approved, and even prayer was limited to Latin, there were still people who preserved another kind of memory. They didn't use swords, they didn't preach from pulpits, and they worked in silence. The truth will wear a cloak when it is written by those who wield the sword and wear the holy robes, but it will still drip with blood. They maintained the bits of information that had been removed from the official narrative and used symbols to transmit knowledge, which made them targets. They go by names that have been lost to time, such as the Templars, Cathars, Rosicrucians, and others. The Cathars, a spiritual movement that flourished in southern France during the 12th and 13th centuries, are their common thread. They were outside of official history and were finally written out of it. They rejected materialism and believed in purity. They did not revere authority. They did not see the Roman Church as the only word of God. And most significantly, they did not think that God could ever order someone to commit murder. They believed that evil could not originate in heaven. This may seem innocuous, but Pope Innocent III deemed them a menace and began the Albigensian Crusade to eradicate them. Whether Cathar or not, tens of thousands of people perished when the city of Algeciras was destroyed by fire. No mercy, no trial, no distinction. Then came the Knights Templar, one of the most powerful and mysterious forces of the medieval world. They fought in the Crusades, had the Pope's endorsement, owned land all over Europe, and most importantly built their own system of knowledge. They weren't just warriors. They ran banking networks, used encryption, had secret symbols, and guarded documents that no one else had ever seen. However, over time, they became too wealthy, too independent, and too difficult to control. In a world where there can only be one official narrative, anyone with a voice must be silenced. In 1307, the entire Templar order was arrested in one night under pressure from King Philip IV of France, and with Pope Clement V's approval, they were tortured, forced to confess to heresy, burnt at the stake, had their assets seized, had their memories destroyed, and were marked as lost souls or fallen knights in the official history. However, the truth was that they were guardians of a parallel stream of knowledge which was erased before they could complete their side of the story. Lastly, the Rosicrucians, also known as the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, were a mysterious group that emerged in early 17th century Europe and issued manifestos calling for intellectual awakening and the fusion of science, spirituality, and philosophy. They simply declared that human history was a profound inner journey and a search for truth beyond dogma, rather than merely the rise and fall of empires. They didn't start a church or pursue power. They were immediately under attack from both sides. They were labeled heretics by the church because of their concern about promoting free thought. The ruling class pushed their name into the background because people stop asking inquiries when something is labeled too mysterious. History didn't need to burn them any longer once they were mystified, as though they had never truly been and transformed into myth. And once the question was put aside, nearly all of the prominent Templar leaders were seized at the same time throughout France. On October 13th, 1307, a Friday morning, this was the quietest execution of all men since it was thought to be trivial. We commonly refer to it as a purge because there is no conflict, no uprising, only a royal order, a silent nod from the Pope, and a list of names that has already been compiled. In actuality, though, it was more akin to a memory execution that was flawless and undetectable. Why the Templars were previously considered crusade heroes is the question. The Pope himself gave them powers that exempted them from secular laws. They managed banks, safeguarded pilgrims, and established networks throughout Europe. They had one thing that the power could never accept: they were outside of control. They didn't betray anyone, rebel, or overtly defy. King Philip IV of France owed the Templars a huge debt, but they also had money, their own knowledge, their own symbols, their own libraries, and connections to ancient knowledge circles and political forces. Worse, they had their own memory, a version of history distinct from the official one. History started to be altered because Pope Clement V was under political pressure from the French monarchy, and the Church began to see the Templars as a growing threat rather than as obedient tools. The Templars were charged with heresy for engaging in deviant rites and worshipping demons. Confessions collected under torture are the only solid proof. Their members were burned, their assets were taken, and their names were removed from official records. Before he died, Jacques de Maule, the last Grand Master of the Templars, turned to face the king and the Pope and declared, "Within a year, you will both appear before God's court to answer for this crime." According to the narrative, Philip IV and Clement V both passed away within a year. Even though it sounds like a legend, the fact that it became known tells you everything. The Templars were relegated to myth, conspiracy theories, and whispers, rather than being recognized as a significant cultural and political power. Because pushing a story off the serious stage and turning it into a midnight tale is simplothan, refuting it. Since then, a lot of people have believed that the Templars were only knights. They forget that they used to manage banking systems and create architectural designs. The Purge of 1307 was more than simply a political event. It was a locked door that closed off a large archive of memory that was never permitted to be recognized. Encryption was used to create networks of influence and possibly hold a complete forbidden lineage of knowledge. Nobody was brave enough to repeat the Templars' tale. Additionally, when no one speaks, as is always the case in history, it indicates that the winners have completed writing the last chapter. The Renaissance is sometimes described as a golden period, a great awakening following the protracted Middle Ages, and the time when humanity rediscovers reason, art, science, and ancient philosophy. When lost information was finally returned during Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Galileo's lifetime, it sounded heroic and promising. However, if you examine it more closely, one important question is subtly omitted, because the Renaissance was a chosen recovery and curated resurrection rather than a full excavation of history. Who was permitted to restore the past, and what precisely were they restoring? And those with the ability to choose also had the ability to erase, just like in every previous period. Not everyone was accepted in the Renaissance. Hunted down, translated, and celebrated were ancient Greek and Roman works. But in Indian knowledge, Iran, Africa's Islamic world, it was frequently written off as aliens, magical, or incompatible with Europe's enlightened attitude. Some of it had its material stolen, but the source removed. Some had been muted, and others had been mistranslated. Similarly, some thinkers, such as Plato and Aristotle, were brought back to life. But other schools of thought, such as pre-Christian mysticism or extinct religions, such as Gnosticism and Kabbalah, were viewed as esoteric side topics that were never given any attention. You can see where this is headed. The Renaissance was a reconstruction of memory through the prism of the present. Not only a rebirth. Does that imply that only those aspects of the past that supported the emerging worldview were revived? The others are still buried. For instance, Arabic mathematical advancements were studied and implemented even throughout the so-called era of light, but they were frequently attributed to European innovations. Although translations of Persian medical literature were made, the translators received greater recognition than the original writers. Even old maps found in Middle Eastern manuscripts were reprinted in Western literature under the guise of European exploration. But the real sources were deleted. And what about individuals who, as Templar descendants, Cathars, or indigenous knowledge traditions, had protected forbidden memories during the Middle Ages but were excluded from the Renaissance? Their wisdom was still classified as mystical, illogical, and anti-progress, and they continued to be outsiders. Here is the actual query, then. Because when you only illuminate the parts of history that support your story, everything else remains in the dark, or worse, is dismissed as not deserving of re-examination. Was the Renaissance really a rebirth, or a rewriting of history? Indeed, Galileo used his telescope to look up at the sky, and Leonardo created a remarkably accurate map of the human anatomy. But the majority of people in that era still lived in a society that viewed information, that did not support the established order of power as harmful or unimportant. You see, don't you, that even after the medieval curtain was removed, just a few people still had access to the stage, while innumerable more texts were still concealed backstage. One of the most revolutionary inventions in human history then emerged in the midst of the Renaissance surge. The printing press, invented by Gutenberg, the written word was released from the confines of monasteries for the first time. For the first time, books weren't considered the exclusive property of the wealthy. For the first time, information could be quickly and extensively replicated across generations and boundaries. It was like a dream of illumination. Indeed, it was a revolution in many respects. But if you dig a little farther, you'll find something important. Freedom wasn't always brought about by the printing revolution. It just altered the balance of power. Prior to that, the flow of knowledge was regulated by the church and monastery scribes, who copied by hand in the dark on pricey parchment. With the printing press, books could now be produced indefinitely. However, the main concern was who got to print it, who could disseminate it, who was in command of the content, because those in authority knew that it would be dangerous if anyone could print anything. Kingdoms and churches acted quickly to control the new technology. By the late 15th century, every printing press in France, Germany, and Spain required a license. Before they could be published, all books had to be approved. Anything deemed contentious, heretical, or destabilizing was prohibited, confiscated, and burned. Printers were occasionally fined and occasionally put to death. Did you know that compiling a list of books that were prohibited was one of the first things the Inquisition did after the press was invented. The index of books that were prohibited was known as the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, and it wasn't a small list. Throughout the course of centuries, thousands of titles were banned, ranging from non-Latin Bible translations to Greek philosophy to scientific, medical, and political books. Even native language Bible editions, like Tyndale's English and Luther's German, were outlawed or set on fire. What that indicates is that, while under the watchful eye of those in control of the censorship keys, knowledge was only copied more quickly rather than really liberated. But in the age of print, hundreds or thousands of copies could be burnt at once, eliminating any chance for a different viewpoint to survive. In fact, there were periods when print shops were so strictly regulated that they turned into propaganda machines. Imagine that when a book was banned in the manuscript era, only one copy might be. Churches reviewed the manuscripts after governments demanded the content. You see it now, don't you? Technology doesn't free people on its own. Whoever owns the technology determines who it serves. If it challenged the established order, it wasn't printed. If it supported the dominant faith, thousands of copies were printed and distributed for free. The printing press wasn't the issue. Rather, it was a tool used by the powerful to uphold rather than undermine authority. Thus, we received something different in place of the hope that everyone would have access to the truth. Truth was still cut, wrapped, and selected at a rapid pace. When ships cut across oceans, traversed the Atlantic, and arrived in Asia, Europe began its era of adventure. Not only did they bring gold, gunpowder, and weaponry to Africa and the Americas, but they also brought their own story, which they used to rewrite the history of the places they came across, lands that had never been written about by them before. Colonial history, in which the conqueror's myth of discovery took the place of a people's history. Millions of indigenous people with their own civilizations, languages, and faiths had left the Americas as though no one had ever lived there before. They were the New World. Did you know that when Hernando Cortés arrived in Mexico, the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan had sophisticated canals, urban planning, marketplaces, and public sanitation far beyond many European cities at the time? After the conquest, the entire city was destroyed, and native history was rewritten into the myth of Spanish civilization saving the primitive natives. The great temples of the Inca, Maya, and Aztec were no longer centers of knowledge. Instead, they were labeled savage sites in need of salvation by gun and God. In Africa, the situation is the same. Libraries, trading networks, and legal codes were features of empires such as Mali, Songhai, and Great Zimbabwe. As you can see, history wasn't wiped. Rather, it was rewritten from a single point of view, and it didn't end with words. When colonizers arrived, they referred to Africa as the dark continent that needed Western light since it was uneducated and backward. Stolen artifacts, including human skulls, mummies, ancestral statues, and religious masks, were presented in European museums under the heading of evidence of early human evolution rather than loot from colonies. In other words, the people they subjugated were presented as a rudimentary stage of human evolution. Even folklore and language names were disregarded as superstitious, inferior, and anti-progress. Next came schooling, where Indian kids were taught about British history, Algerian kids' history of France, Filipino kids, the history of America. Growing up in that system makes you think that my people needed to be civilized. So I'm glad we were colonized. It's not their history, but the history of those who came and plundered, then taught them the honorable justifications for doing so. My forefathers were barbarians. At that point, history becomes a tool for forgetting rather than a tool for remembering. Ignore who you are and the equality of your civilization. Ignore the fact that there were whole knowledge systems outside of formal science, outside of the Western paradigm, and outside of God. The worst part is when you begin to feel embarrassed about your ancestors' memory. If the colonial era was a period in which the powerful overshadowed the weak, then the world wars were a period in which the victorious overshadowed the defeated. But this time, neither swords nor missionaries were used. Cameras were used. International conferences, publications, textbooks, and worldwide propaganda efforts. Tens of millions were slaughtered in World Wars I and II, the two biggest and most destructive conflicts in human history. They also redrew borders and rearranged the global power structure. After the smoke cleared, history was rewritten with the truth, but with the acceptable truth. Let's begin with a basic fact. Following World War II, the plot was clearly defined, with heroes and villains. Humanity's nemesis was fascism. The world was saved by the Obelisk. While the myth isn't totally incorrect, it is far from comprehensive. Following the war, many Nazi generals, scientists, and engineers were killed, and a significant amount of Nazi paperwork was destroyed. Through programs like Paperclip, both the US and the USSR surreptitiously recruited them. Their names were cleared, their histories erased, and their contributions reframed. One of them was a NASA rocket engineer. Weapons were created for the USSR by another. Similarly, the atrocities carried out by the Allies, such as the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the firebombing of German cities that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, were deemed necessary and unavoidable, or the only way to end the war. However, the official histories hardly ever mention their ties to concentration camps, because once you serve the winner, your past can be rewritten. The tendency is that when the winners write history, they don't have to explain everything. They just need to make it seem plausible. Would the historical narrative be so forgiving if the Axis countries had used atomic bombs first? Additionally, they just avoid discussing anything that cannot be defended. The world's official historical, the one we study in school, is a significantly altered screenplay that highlights the wrongdoings of the defeated. It minimizes the transgressions of the winners and, above all, silences the voices that were never let to be heard. Japanese atomic bomb survivors, absence of a specific chapter, Allied airstrikes, killed German citizens, hardly a footnote. Historians, philosophers, and writers from the losing side who were deemed harmful were left out of the story. Even now, anyone who disputes how the war is remembered is immediately called a revisionist, or worse, accused of having the wrong side's sympathies. What that indicates is that war history is no longer a matter of recollection. Because they lack printing presses, the losers in that narrative are unable to tell theirs. It involves framing a manufactured story that has been edited, scripted, and repeated until everyone knows the words by heart. The media is not owned by them. They are not allowed to host international conferences. The textbooks are not written by them. They only have memory left, and official documents don't mention memory. Following World War II, the globe entered a protracted, peaceful conflict in which bombs were simply the surface of things, rather than the kind of calm that many had hoped for. Memory served as the actual battlefield. Each side had its own version of history, and in the US, children were taught that communism was the biggest threat to humanity. The Cold War was not just a conflict between the US and the Soviet Union. It was a struggle over who got to define the world, who was oppressive and who was free, who stood for justice and who for evil, who represented the future and who was impeding progress. Children in the Soviet Union were taught that capitalism was a system of worldwide pain and exploitation. Propaganda, posters, films, history textbooks, and lessons are all thoughtfully constructed to promote a particular worldview and, more significantly, to persuade them that we are the good guys. Did you know that both the US and the Soviet Union had specialized agencies during this time period to write and obliterate history, in addition to spying and sabotaging? The CIA and organizations such as the Congress for Cultural Freedom in the US covertly provided funding to European artists, writers, journalists, and academics in order to advance a free culture that resisted Soviet dominance. Without ever disclosing who was in charge, they frequently sponsored publications, directed research, and even influenced public discussions. Many post-war European intellectuals who produced anti-communist critiques thought they were acting independently, but in reality, American intelligence frequently provided them with covert support. The Soviet Union used the same tactic, with official publishing houses and state-run censorship departments, to reflect the current political climate. The history of the Russian Revolution, Lenin, Stalin, and Soviet satellite republics was repeatedly altered. When a once celebrated person lost favor, their name was removed from the books, and their face was removed from group photos. Generations of people grew up unaware that those persons even existed. People who formerly shaped the country in which they currently reside. And when both sides accomplish this, a peculiar reality enters the globe. There are now conflicting versions of truth rather than a single objective truth, with each side presenting their version of events. Thus, a young Russian and a young American could view the same event, such as the Vietnam War, and have very different perspectives. They were only ever given half the story. Not because they are lying. Here's where the actual risk lies. People cease to believe in any truth when there are too many contradicting facts. The Cold War was a fight that shattered global memory, not merely a competition for nuclear weapons. Each nation was compelled to choose a side, and in doing so, they selected the historical narrative they would use to teach, remember, and transmit viewpoints that were not associated with either superpower. The global memory map no longer includes the silenced history of colonized states, indigenous peoples, and stateless populations. In an instant, two superpowers designed the planet to function on a sort of antiquated operating system. Telling your own tale would have resulted in you being called a spy, traitor, or enemy tool. Both countries realized something crucial when direct conflict between the US and the Soviet Union was no longer a viable option, and nuclear bombs were too hazardous to employ. The world's mind belongs to whoever prevails in culture and ideas. Thus, Rather than using spies to go behind enemy lines, the CIA used writers, poets, filmmakers, professors, magazine editors, and editors. It may sound insane, yet it is precisely what took place. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, or CCF, was one of the most advanced Cold War initiatives. On the surface, it appeared to be a commendable endeavor, a standalone organization promoting European intellectual life after the war, assisting authors in advancing freedom of expression and planning scholarly conferences. However, the CIA planned, directed, and provided all funding behind the scenes. They weren't producing your articles. Instead, they were choosing which ones were published, who was allowed to speak at conferences, whose books were printed, and which writers were assigned the title of freedom advocates. Although you were free to write anything you wanted, if you wrote what they wanted to promote, you received support, and it was seen to be the correct message. Pro-Western and anti-communist, praising America as the beacon of civilization. How did that result in a whole cultural content ecosystem that included Tempo Presenti in Italy, Proofs in France, and Encounter magazine in the UK, complete with incisive, thought-provoking prose that had already undergone multiple rounds of silent approval? Philosophers, poets, critics, and authors all appeared to be independent, but many were subtly guided by gentle influences, by funding, not by censorship, but by selecting who receives funds, publications, and invitations to the upcoming major international symposium. When given a stage, a young writer who writes an essay that supports the message gets pushed, yet they produce something that doesn't suit. Apologies, this is not a good editorial fit. That implies that everyone was unaware of the reprogramming of the post-World War to intellectual landscape. You read an essay and believe it to be original. A jazz album comes on, you believe it to be revolt. You view a Hollywood movie, you believe it to be anti-war. But when you look at it all at once, you can see the pattern. Softly, wonderfully, and repeatedly, a story is told. Individualism is beneficial. The West is a contemporary place. Communism is outdated, and the epicenter of reason, advancement, and humanity is America. Now notice that this was propaganda disguised as art, not obscene propaganda like Nazi posters or Soviet murals. This made it 100 times more effective, because you will believe an idea presented in a beautiful movie, a poignant song, or a heartbreaking book without ever feeling under duress. And that's how the CIA changed the course of history. They needed you to fall in love with a version of the present they had already created, not via textbooks, but through motion. Have you ever pondered why some questions are never included in university curricula? Why do some doctoral dissertations never get accepted? Why are some historical events, despite abundant evidence, nevertheless deemed to be illogical, methodologically flawed, or just not academically sound? The quality of the research is not the answer. Rather, it is who gets to share the facts. The most trustworthy knowledge is supposedly produced in the contemporary academic world of BTech, with all of its research institutes, peer-reviewed journals, and scholarly committees. However, few individuals question. Let's start with a fundamental reality. Who finances it all? And what sort of truth are they paying for? The cost of research is high. Grants are necessary for professors. Funding is necessary for universities. Impact scores and editorial boards are necessary for academic journals. Therefore, it stands to reason that the person with the money controls the path of knowledge. Did you know that numerous political, historical, and social study programs at prominent American universities were covertly supported by civilian groups that turned out to be CIA fronts during the years following World War II? Nobody needs to be coerced into writing anything. People in the system quickly understood which research gets published, which doesn't, which themes will get you a job, and which ones would have you labeled controversial. They didn't limit topics, they just financed the ones they liked. Let's say you are writing about the good role of communism in decolonization and its impact on Africa. I wish you success in becoming published. Let's say you are examining the Vietnam War, and you present America's involvement as an invasion rather than support. Write about the advantages of Western free markets in post-colonial countries, but be prepared to be accused of bias. Your paper is mentioned, and all of a sudden you are asked to speak. When your next grant tariffs, seeing the trend, academia shifted from being a place to discover truth to one that filtered out what truths were acceptable. And as time went on, the history taught in schools changed from being a convoluted and nuanced human memory to a tidy account supported by the person who was paying the bills. And what about the scholars who didn't fit in? Many of them went on to publish independently, but they didn't have peer-reviewed journals, an ISBN, or recognition from the mainstream academic community. They were written off as unprofessional, unsubstantiated, and lacking in academic rigor, which basically means that the only way to be heard is to speak in a voice that the system approves of. You don't need to silence any other voices. You simply don't allow it to show. As a result, students all around the world continue to read dense textbooks that are thoroughly academic and beautifully designed, full of citations, but they are unaware that what they are reading is a subsidized version of history. Have you ever held a textbook on history from any nation and thought it was just the facts, simplified for students? It is a system of controlled memory rather than only knowledge. Textbooks don't just appear overnight. They are the result of committees making political decisions behind closed doors about what is appropriate, what reflects the spirit of the country, what preserves cultural identity, and most importantly, what avoids controversy. You know what that means, right? When people avoid controversy, they're frequently just deleting the difficult and/or awkward parts of memory. Consider a straightforward scenario. The Vietnam War students in the US are taught that the goal was to keep communism in Southeast Asia under control. It is presented as a valiant form of resistance against Americans in Vietnam. Imperialism, South Korea frames it as a component of the worldwide fight against communism, while France downplays it because they don't want to draw attention to the colonial occupation of Indochina. Different stories about the same conflict, all geared towards preserving Monaro. Additionally, students who are raised with that interpretation of history retain a rigid conception of it when someone shares a different version later. In life, people perceive it as betrayal rather than just another viewpoint. Apply the same reasoning to other historical periods now. The rape of Nanking, the system of sexual servitude, and the use of humans in experimentation during World War II are all frequently minimized or left out of Japanese textbooks. These are major curricular topics in China, whereas South Korean students study the protracted, agonizing fight for dignity during Japanese occupation. These tales are frequently ignored in the U.S. as attention is diverted to the valiant American warriors' liberation of Asia. Or take the 1943 Bengal famine, in which 3 million Indians perished while living under British colonial control. It is depicted as a direct consequence of British policies in Indian textbooks. That incident goes hardly unnoticed in British textbooks. You see, history is about who gets to tell it and who edits it, not about the event itself. And the most crucial part is that kids aren't given a choice. They're only shown one version, which has been approved by a ministry, taught by a teacher, tested in exams, and ingrained in their minds as truth. In actuality, though, it's just a state-sponsored memory, and once a memory is ingrained from an early age, it becomes the most deeply held belief. Students will defend it as if it were sacred truth, and no one needs to censor it. As the adage goes, history is written by the victors. Indeed, but only temporarily, as the vanquished soon learn to share their stories as well. Initially, they lacked textbooks, academic support, publishers, and printing presses. Oral recollections, smuggled notes, unpublished diaries, or bits of testimony buried deep in forgotten archives were all they possessed. However, after gaining independence, colonized nations started to regain not just their land, but also their right to tell their history. They would now study their own stories, which had previously been removed from the textbooks, rather than only Voltaire's philosophy or the magnificence of Anglo-Saxon civilization. In India, post-colonial academics re-examined the British Empire as a system of intentional extraction that caused famines and cultural disintegration, rather than as a time of infrastructure development. In order to regain the right to define themselves, African voices, such as Ngugi wa Thiong'o, decided to publish literature, theory, and history in their own languages rather than in English or French. Historians and activists in Latin America began recounting historical events such as coups, CIA meddling, and peasant killings that were previously concealed behind genteel terms like protecting freedom. Even in the vanquished countries of Japan and Germany during World War II, courageous academics and philosophers began to question what had transpired, who were the complicit victims, and who altered history in order to clear their own names. Additionally, new movements rooted Black history and women's history in the United States. History of LGBTQ+ Native American history is a potent attempt to restore long-suppressed voices. When the internet arrived, the game completely transformed. Individuals outside the system might freely create a blog or podcast, submit a video, and publish it. They did not require the seal of peer-reviewed validity or approval from an academic board, and the audience started to pay attention. Of course, not all information found online can be trusted. For the first time, history became a contentious topic, even though not everyone writes honestly. There are now multiple crossing narratives that clash, question, and challenge one another, rather than just one version that is constantly repeated in lecture halls, classrooms, and news channels. This is a gift in and of itself, since history ceases to be a monopoly when more individuals are permitted to tell the story. We start to see who was previously silenced, what was once erased, and why they are now speaking, even if no one ever taught them how to hold a pen. Even if it's late and painful, in the midst of all the tales of nations striving to change the past. There is a subdued undercurrent that has persisted longer than most kingdoms while having no flag, army, or empire. With networks firmly entrenched in the elite, from politics and finance to science, art, and education, this hidden organization has no borders, no troops, and no territory. They are referred to as Freemasons. They are said to have started out as builders, stonemasons, and architects in the Middle Ages, but as time went on, they evolved into architects of symbols of memory. They never claimed to be in a position of authority, but their fingerprints can be found on the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and the 18th century ideological revolutions. Many of the most notable people in history, including George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Voltaire, Mozart, and others, were Freemasons. What makes them unique, though, is this. Instead of writing history in textbooks, they redefined terms like light, knowledge, enlightenment, truth, and freedom, and encoded them in symbols found in buildings and rituals. Have you ever noticed that the pyramid on the US dollar bill has an all-seeing eye? It's a Masonic emblem, not a coincidence, because they felt that truth should be found rather than enforced. Additionally, they placed symbols in your line of sight rather than telling you what to think. Courts in schools, did they rewrite history? They said, observing the public architecture. Not in the typical manner. They created an underground layer of history, a parallel stream of information that was not widely known but had sway over people who would eventually write history for the general public. They did not destroy books or suppress records. Consider it, if you were a politician, academic, or legislator who grew up in a Freemasonic setting that instilled in you a sense of critical thinking, ancient symbols, Western mysticism, and personal accountability for the truth, unlike the others, how would you write history? Some claim that Freemasons were responsible for world orders, revolutions, and wars. But perhaps there is a deeper and simpler truth. They were changing the concept of power itself, not pursuing political power. Power comes from influencing people's thoughts rather than using force, and they have done this for millennia by keeping an enduring collection of symbols, asterisk, a location where history is preserved but never fully revealed, where the truth is in how you interpret the symbol rather than on paper. Freemasonry never tells you what to believe, but it gives you the freedom to question everything you've been told. Maybe that's why people who have left dogmatic institutions have frequently sought refuge in Freemasonry throughout history, to erase history, but to uncover the layers that have been hidden by those in positions of power who only wanted one version to endure, not because they are afraid, but because no one would believe them if they were uttered out. Some people are afraid to speak certain things. However, if same items are carved into stone and shown in the open, giving the impression that they are merely ornamental, they will endure for centuries without being censored. Nobody will raise an objection, and soon, ma'am, someone will start to question, why is there an Egyptian obelisk more than 150 meters high in the center of Washington, D.C., known as the Washington Monument? Why does the US dollar's pyramid have an all-seeing eye at the top and the Latin word below it? The new order of the ages is known as Ordo Seclorum. Why do European Gothic churches adhere to the golden ratio, repetition of the same symbols and historical numerical precision in stone laying the six-pointed star? the moon, and the sun. If you start to pay closely, you'll see that history is hidden in geometry rather than just being documented in words. What's even more odd is that these symbols are never officially explained. They are not included in textbooks. They simply stand there, as though to say, if you understand, you understand, without any tour signage indicating their location. Otherwise, snap a selfie and go on. And since symbols are the language of the second layer of knowledge, that is no coincidence. The layer is not intended for widespread use or popularization. A layer in which history is a system of codes, rather than merely a timeline. Consider the obelisk, an upward-pointing stone column that was originally observed in ancient Egypt. It represented the connection between spirit and the cosmos, between heaven and earth. However, why are obelisks located in the center of political power in Washington, the Vatican, and Paris? And why do people congregate in front of these symbols, also known as the Eye of Providence, in the triangle during important ceremonies? It can be seen in movies, paintings, and even architecture. It is frequently dismissed as the Eye of God. But why is it so closely related to Gnostic writings, Freemasonry, and medieval church lighting systems? Then there is sacred mathematics, the golden ratio 1, the number 7 in Judeo-Christian traditions, the 13 stars and arrows on the dollar bill, the number 33 in Freemasonry, and 618 in the Fibonacci series. These are deliberate norms that are repeated throughout governmental rituals, architecture, urban design, and even scripture. Do you see how some people choose to incorporate history into buildings now that it is illegal to do so? Buildings cannot be censored, and no one has the right to destroy an old wall because it has an odd symbol carved into it. Symbols endure through all governments, ideologies, and textbook revisions. They only need to exist. They don't need to be believed. One day, someone will start to re-examine, ask questions, and realize that while the history we're taught may not be entirely false, it has omitted everything that has always been in front of us. History was formerly recorded by human voices in texts cut into stone. But a weird new era is upon us. An algorithm is telling the history. You launch youtube.tiktoku, type a phrase into Google. French Revolution and the Vietnam War, who constructed the pyramids? The line of truth is not what appears. It is a series of choices chosen by machines rather than historians. Not what's most accurate, but the most widely accepted, what receives the highest level of interaction. The era of post-truth history is what causes you to stop scrolling. Whether it's true or not is less important than whether it seems appealing, matches your target audience, or complements things you already enjoy. After learning about you, the algorithm starts You'll eventually find yourself living within your own version of history, complete with sources, film, and knowledgeable voices, as you spend more time watching a certain point of view. However, it is totally unrelated to anything that opposes it. You start to believe that this is the truth, but in actuality, it has been broken up into pieces and then put back together to fit your own feed. AI is more than just a search engine these days. It can also make history, an analysis pieced together by machines from millions of sources, a doctored photo, a phony video, or even a virtual expert with a flawless human voice, perfect reasoning. But nobody knows who created the screenplay. And you might think what you're seeing is history, if you don't have the depth to compare and dispute. At that point, machines start to recreate human memory. Nobody signs it, and a huge system that is always learning your behaviors and reciting the past in the most appetizing and seamless way possible is all that is responsible. History becomes information that you browse through. It is no longer in-depth, quick, or disputed, but rather repeated. And when something is spoken enough times, it becomes well known. Not because it's accurate, but rather because nobody checks anymore. Something unexpected occurred when people started to doubt. Everything in a world where nobody knows who to believe and history is condensed into 30-second films. They once again began looking for authentic voices, not flawless voices, not university-approved, not TV-suited, but sincere, patient, and not scared to pose challenging questions. As a result, a new generation of storytellers emerged not from national libraries, but from bedrooms, microphones plugged into laptops, YouTube channels, Spotify feeds, and Substack newsletters. Voices that were previously dismissed as unofficial started to find audiences of their own. And the surprising thing is that more and more people are listening to podcasts that re-examine the Vatican or YouTube channels that retell history through a post-colonial lens, Freemasonry or wartime disappearances, freelance journalists reopening cases the mainstream left behind. Two independent researchers without degrees but have decades of in-depth investigation and neglected archives, they are all creating a new memory network. And the most crucial aspect is that there isn't a central censor or authorized version. Every channel has a voice, and viewers are free to listen, dispute, or believe what they want. Naturally, not all of this is true. Not all voices use evidence carefully. However, independent historians are able to address subjects that the traditional system has long shunned since they are not constrained by academic constraints, which has led to a surge in resistive history. Unofficially quiet but expanding, for instance. Many people first became aware of the horrors of Belgian colonization in the Congo through an independent documentary using historical photos and captions rather than in school. Many people learn about the hazy realities of Iraq's liberation from an investigative podcast rather than from large media. The map of Palestine from 1946 to the present was first seen by many on a TikTok. As the old system drowns in skepticism, you see these new voices, no matter how small, are gaining trust not because they are perfect, but because they dare to speak the hard truth. A new order of memory is subtly emerging as a result of their courage to acknowledge what they still don't know. Instead of a national broadcaster reading the past on your behalf or a shared history from school textbooks, millions of people each have a unique perspective, tale, and moment in time, which the audience gradually pieces together to create something more complex. Indeed, it's disorganized. The fact that memory is returning to those who were previously denied the ability to remember is one reason to be hopeful in this post-truth era of history. 2. We were raised with the simple belief that there is such a thing as objective truth, that what happened, happened, and it cannot be changed, that history's job is to recover that truth. Yes, there are mistakes, but perhaps for the first time in a long time, people are relearning how to think critically, how to question, and how to seek truth, rather than waiting for someone to serve it to them. However, the more you search and The more fragmented memories you start piecing together, you can reach a painful realization. Perhaps because people don't keep records of events, historical truth has never existed as a single, cohesive entity. They document their understanding of events, and you get a totally different account of history depending on your point of view. In a government report, someone who was shot dead can be identified as a rebel, a martyr in a resistance movement's archive, a regrettable mishap in a military memo, a case in a newspaper file that is being investigated depending on who is narrating the narrative. Any or all of these could be true. There, a contentious yet significant school of thought is born. In the field of history, postmodernism, they don't say there is no truth. They don't dispute that things happened. They assert that all truths are tellings, and that all tellings are influenced by communal memory, language, emotion, and power. There is no true original, only versions that are accepted and versions that are silenced, because history is referred to as a discourse and a created narrative that is arranged by the storyteller, not by some camera hovering above it all. You might think this is risky. If there is no objective truth, then anyone can pretend that everyone is correct, and anarchy ensues. However, postmodern theory really promotes responsibility in storytelling rather than chaos, because you become more modest, cautious, and critical of yourself once you realize that no one is impartial while recalling. History is no longer a straight line, because they teach us to inquire not what is true, but rather who is speaking to whom and under what authority, as well as who has been compelled to keep quiet. It turns into a multifaceted map with traces of power, intent, and emotion in each rendition. And our job is to examine all the pieces rather than search for the one ideal form, as school textbooks originally hoped. Pay attention to a variety of voices that are specificaliquistone, and recognize that each version is inherently incomplete. Do you realize that the threat is not that there is no truth? Believing there is only one truth and being compelled to accept it without investigation is dangerous. The textbook you read in 4th grade, the monuments you pass without noticing, the stories your grandmother told, the videos you watch, the concepts you repeat without ever questioning their origins. Well, we grow up thinking that history is something you learn, but in reality, it's something you live with in silence every day. Eventually, you realize that you're living inside a version of history, a story that was created by someone else and repeated so frequently that it seems to be true. However, as this journey has shown, nothing in history is natural, because everything is a decision. Nothing is remembered. Who survives only in murmurs? Who is forgotten? Who is mentioned in textbooks? And this is the most difficult reality. Someone else will tell your story if you don't, and they'll do it in a way that benefits them. They'll refer to your ancestors as savages. Your remembrance will be referred to as folklore. The deepest kind of dominance is when they label your history as something that needed to be civilized, and you grow up believing you were fortunate to have been taught it. Simply change your memory. There's no need to battle, kill, or reign. Have you ever read it as a child? It explains why the greatest power is not found in thrones, money, or weapons. It resides in the freedom to write, to speak, to recall, and to reclaim that freedom by challenging your long-held beliefs. Reading what was previously deleted, by narrating the stories that no one believed were important, It is not necessary to be a historian. You don't have to write books, simply said. You must not allow anyone else to define your memory, because if you don't speak, someone else will, and if they talk for a long enough period of time, you may forget that you ever had a voice, which is the most dreadful loss. If, after everything, you ask, who is behind all the rewriting of history? Not a single secret society, not one shadowy figure, but a long chain of people, systems, and motives that constantly present themselves in changing form over centuries. This is not war, genocide, or censorship, but the quiet, willing, permanent forgetting of oneself. If you still remember, if you still wonder, if you still ask, if you still feel the urge to tell, then history is not over, because they won and want to be remembered in their own way. Some people rewrite history. Some people have complete control of memory instruments, such as printing presses, algorithms, and scrolls, and they decide what should be repeated. Others don't have to do anything at all. They simply profit when people remember things incorrectly. Therefore, if you ask who the invisible hand behind it all is, the answer is anyone who can rewrite memory without being questioned. Then you realize that true power doesn't reside in armies, governments, or even wealth. Rather, it lies in who is allowed to speak and who is forced to forget. Lastly, what's left is not an answer, but rather a deeply personal question. No one needs to silence you as long as you think you already know enough. Sometimes the act of remembering is enough to shatter the entire architecture of forgetfulness, and that's when history really starts. Will you continue to have others tell your story, or will you start writing it yourself? If history has always been written by the victors, then what have we never been told? Subscribe to Secret Historian, where the silence of the past is finally broken. New, hidden truths are revealed every week. Unlock the secrets before they disappear again.